Okay, so this is Richter lecture number 4. Let's start with sharing screen. Okay, this is chapter 7 of 8 before the revolution. So one of the key distinctions in this new pattern of settlement on the East Coast that the English began to pursue was that they were a settler colony. So a settler colony, as opposed to extraction, is there to get rich and then go home, or to serve as a funnel for taking things out of the colony and shipping them back to the old world. This settler colony is a transplantation of people from the old world to the new with the intent to stay, right? So when we talk about the Virginia colony, it started off as an extraction colony, but it turned into a settler colony. But the settler colonies of New England, of the greater New England area, they were meant to stay from the beginning. So when these settlers stay, they transform the land, where they change it from what was the practices before to one that suits their need. So this transformation of the land changes it. I should note that Native peoples transformed the land to suit their needs before the arrival of Europeans. But what these settlers do is going to transform the land to suit their needs, which change it to some degree away from what the Native peoples were using it for and what they would want it to use it for. So this transformation of the land means that they're going to stay on the land, and they also intend to pass on to their descendants both the land they have and their practices of transformation and occupation to new places, right? So the settler colony, they're setting up shop, as it were. In a relatively brief period, 1630 to 1660, you have greater than 50,000 migrants who travel to North America, primarily to two locations. The New England colonies, about 20,000 of those folks went there, and a little bit more than 30,000 went to Virginia or the Chesapeake colonies. And we're going to compare and contrast the two. But before we start comparing and contrasting the two, we want to talk about, well, why were these people leaving Great Britain? Well, there's a number of reasons. First, the population of the British Isles, as it would be referred to at that time, was increasing and increasing fairly steadily. So you have an increasing population. At the same time, you have the continuing effects of a movement known as enclosure. Enclosure is transforming the old practices of subletting your land to tenants who farm it. In the feudal period, those were peasants. In this transformation from feudal to a capitalist economy, as things begin to change, there's still people who are renting the property. And they're using it for their own basic sustenance and maybe a little extra production for trade, right? This enclosure movement is a change by the property owners, the royalty and aristocracy of the British Isles, who transform what was, basically a subsistence economy, growing basic foodstuffs, into a movement for trade. And this trade frequently centered around the production of wool. In the Scottish Highlands, there was a saying that sheep are the eaters of men, which is an interesting way to think about it. And what they meant by that is the sheep come to replace the land that people used to live on before, shoving the people off at the behest of the landowner, of course. So this enclosure movement is breaking the old ways of people living on the land. It's accelerating a process that was going on. So you have more people who are being moved off the land, whether it's because the population is increasing and they can no longer stay in the same areas as the excess population did before, or this enclosure movement is forcibly pushing people off the land. And so they drift into cities and towns, and this is a time period, the 1600 time period of a rapid urbanization process. More and more people are coming to towns and cities. In fact, so many people who are drifting into the towns and cities that there isn't the industry, the factory system, the production method to soak up this excess labor. So you have a lot of folks looking for some sort of opportunity. They're no longer small or middling farmers. They or their descendants have been moved off, and they haven't quite found a niche where they can work and make an income. So you have a lot of tension, let's say. And tied on top of that is there is a number of religious tensions in the British Isles. There were some folks who believed that the Church of England was still maintaining practices that were very similar to Catholicism. And in fact, you had some Catholicism adherents, Roman Catholics, in the British Isles who wanted to go back to being part of the church. And some of these folks were in the aristocracy. So there's a movement of folks who are greatly opposed to these sort of hierarchical traditions, both of the Catholic Church and also of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So this is a time of intense ferment between various religious folks. And some of these folks were broken into two branches. There was one that believed the church can be reformed from within. And then there were those who said it was irredeemable and that they should separate. These separatists, as they were known, were a threat to the Church of England, which was the official Church of England. And so a good deal of them took themselves and their family and went to places like the Netherlands. So there's a lot of religious tension that's roiling the people at this time as well. A portion of these folks decide they're going to establish a new settlement where they can practice their religion freely. And they come, a portion of them come to the region of North America that comes to be known as New England. It's known as New England because they saw many similarities in the landscape to Old England, let's say. So the New England colonies were first settled by mainly, but not exclusively, separatists. So we think about the first voyage of these separatists on the Mayflower. They formed a scarce majority of people who were on the Mayflower were actually pilgrims. But these separatists are coming to establish what they hope to be a purified version of their religion, shorn of the sort of trappings of hierarchy that they charged infiltrated and polluted the Anglican Church, Church of England, and so being free to practice a good, godly community is what they were seeking to do. These Puritans, as they were known, were an interesting set of folks. They saw their success as a manifestation of God's good favor. So they believed that God's either light shining upon them, joyfully, feeling that they're doing a good job and so they should be rewarded, was manifested in everyday events. And they believed the devil was there to disrupt things in everyday events. So they saw great portents, great meaning to everyday events. If there's a hailstorm that hits one portion of the town as opposed to another portion, it's some sort of sign from God that they are operating in disfavorous actions. So these things were a way of living in which God is manifest in everyday events. And with that, they saw that this chosen godly people, as they saw themselves, needed to establish communities in which they could help one another stay on the straight and narrow, to live good, godly lives. So they envisioned their settlements being relatively compact in terms of where they were living, but then they were hoping and expecting to live a life of small-scale farming. So this farming was one where good hard work would transform the landscape into something that suited their needs, again, demonstrating God's favor. So they intended to stay. And they came in a rather short bulge of time called the Great Migration, right? So we first see the Pilgrims, on the Mayflower, and then over the next decade, roughly 20,000 of these Puritans or akin to Puritans came to the New World in the New England colonies. This Great Migration ends rather abruptly with the rise of Oliver Cromwell and his purifying campaign in England to establish a purified government in the English Isles. So with Cromwell's rise back on the island of England, it really ended the Great Migration to the Greater New England area. And in fact, there is very little migration to that region afterwards. Many of the people who lived in the New England colonies came over in this relatively short pulse of time. And this migration stream into New England is different than many migration streams in history. It is a type of family migration. This is a migration pattern in which there is nearly equal balance between men and women, and also a fair number of children. They came as a family unit and moved lock, stock, and barrel across the ocean to these new settlements in New England. They referred to this as a plantation that they were moving to, and that's the structure. It's a place where they intend to become small farmers, raising what they need and trading to the market extra things that they could produce. This unusual pattern of migration, in which you have roughly equal men and women, although maybe a slight majority of men, and the family units, we're coming to a region that was, in terms of the 17th century world, was an extraordinarily healthy place to be. And so this particular pattern of family migration led and a salubrious environment in which to live led to rapid population growth. These families had children, and their children married at very young ages and carved out their own homesteads. And this particular system of production in the New England region is one that's based upon family farms. So there were incentives to have lots of children, aside from it being God's grace, because all hands were needed on deck to make the farm work, and the more hands you had, the more successful the farm was likely to be. This rapid population growth meant that all these newly aging young men and women needed their own property. And so there was a rapid movement, or not rapid movement, but a rapid population growth leading to the movement of new settlements that were established in the same way. They were going to create family farms and transform the landscape to suit their needs. And what this landscape and system of production was called husbandry, which was marrying domestic animals to domestic plants to create an orderly little farm that was sometimes, in some cases, they viewed it as hacked out of the wilderness. So they're transforming woodlands into cleared farming areas and sought to pass this practice on to their descendants, not just their children on their own farm, but help their children establish new farms. So this planter style in the New England area was expanding. And it was expanding, as we have seen, because partly because the land had been recently vacated. So there was relatively, not purely, but relatively easy opportunities to establish new farmlands and new settlements. And they did. Now, in contrast, in a much more usual pattern that you see for migration or in migration studies is the colony of Virginia. Virginia, as we saw in the early period, was a type of extraction colony. They were hoping to get rich. And it was very much a colony that sought to impose that sort of class-based organization to the New World, in which the aristocrats owned property and the common people worked. But it did not fit easily into Virginia. And so the vast majority of people who traveled to the Virginia colonies in the first decade or so of the establishment of the colony ended up dying in Virginia. But over time, this colony continued to straggle along and struggle on. And it actually, the investors went bankrupt shortly after, unfortunately for them, a new product had been developed that was going to make these Virginia colonies and the Chesapeake colonies thrive. That new product is tobacco. This product, a plantation product grown in great volumes, was highly lucrative in its early days. I am not an aficionado of tobacco, but from what I understand, the Virginia Carolina tobacco is the strain that was created was one of the sweeter ones for smoking. So it grabbed a portion of the market very firmly because of the superior quality to other production of tobacco. Tobacco is also a good market-based crop because it's addictive. And so as people packed their little pipes with tobacco and smoked it up, there was an expanding market, right? So the more people who could buy tobacco smoked more tobacco, and so the market increased. So it was a lucrative expanding market, let's say beginning around 1620 or so. This production needed lots of labor. So labor was dear in the New World, meaning that it was hard to come by. So the more people you could get working on your property to produce tobacco, the more money you could make doing it. So there was a demand for labor. These new lands, this new product, tobacco, because it's grown in a monocrop, also has a tendency to exhaust the soil, meaning leaching out the valuable nutrients. Well, in this early period in the Virginia colony, land was available, but labor was expensive. So getting new lands was comparatively easy in this early to mid 17th century timeframe. These new lands could then be turned to produce more and more tobacco. And the people who had the wherewithal to acquire better pieces of property near river courses found great opportunity and wealth. The sense that people had an opportunity to become wealthy in this colonial period in the Virginia colonies drew more and more people to the colonies. So the Virginia colonies attracted greater levels of emigration to this area. And unlike New England, which all came in one pulse, it was fairly steady migration to the Virginia colonies. All this successful effort to grow tobacco led to a market collapse where the price dropped dramatically because of vast overproduction. The colonists in Virginia and the Carolinas North Carolina, got too good at growing tobacco, and so they saturated the market. And so it led to some harsh times for people who were staking a lot on this tobacco production. The migration to the colony, as I said, was much more the typical pattern. Usually in migration studies, the first set of people who migrate tend to be young males, and that's the case in Virginia. So it's overwhelmingly a male migration to the Virginia colony. 2/3 or greater of the people who migrated to the Virginia Chesapeake colonies were males. And they were also young males because they're coming with the attributes of not having much money, but having strong backs. And so much of the migration to this colony is young males. young males overrepresented in a population leads to a much more violent settlement. Young males tend to get in fights more often than family units or older members or predominantly female populations. So this is a historic pattern that young males tend to be more violent societies. And so in comparison to New England, Virginia is a much more rough and ready sort of area, let's say, for colonization. What's also different in this migration pattern to the Virginia colonies is that the majority of people who migrated to these colonies came in some sort of unfree status. They were not primarily in the early to mid 17th century, primarily free laborers coming to make a fortune. They were, so some of the folks who came in unfree status were convicts. It's interesting to, for those who follow jurisprudence that many crimes that used to be receive some sort of capital punishment in England were transformed into something called transportation, which means instead of hanging at the end of a rope in some sort of hideous fashion, they would send you overseas to labor in the colonies, and you'd come over as a convict. This was also a time period where the English were seeking to subdue their Irish colony. Cromwell's forces broke the back of what remained of Irish resistance in Ireland in these 2-year campaign on the Irish island, resulting in lots of people who who were resistant to this English rule ended up being arrested and shipped overseas as convict labor. They usually had a fairly extended sentence, as we shall see, compared to indentured servants, in which they labored away to serve up their time. There were some African slaves. The first record of slavery in the New World of North America is seen in 1619 in Virginia, where there's a note that some slaves were sold in the market. But slaves in the early 17th and mid 17th century were comparatively a smaller portion of this laboring force because slaves were very expensive. And the status of the slaves in the early to mid 17th century is not quite clear in the Virginia colonies, or it would be clarified in the coming decades that they are a separate category. But there seems to be some sort of confusion whether or not slaves were subject to the same sort of long indenturitude that convicts got, or if they were some sort of unusual indentured servant, or if they were regular indentured servants. So the status of the slaves in these communities as laborers, whether that meant they were permanent slaves or not quite clear at this time, right? The records aren't clear on that. But at any rate, slaves were expensive, comparatively speaking. So most of the folks who came to the New World, to the Virginia colony and the Chesapeake colonies, came in the form of something known as indentured, and they were referred to as indentured servants. And indentured servants were a type of temporary slavery. In effect, what an indentured means is that the population in overpopulated England would sign up with a ship captain. And the ship captain would have them sign a contract. So ostensibly, they're freely choosing this. But this indentured contract said the captain will transport them across the Atlantic Ocean to the colonies. And in the colony, their contract will be purchased by someone, and they, the indentured servant, will work to pay off the cost of the contract, usually somewhere between 4 and 5 years. At the end of the indentured, when they have paid off this transportation fee by laboring for the person who owns them, they were supposed to be set up with their first year's crop, the seed, some basic tools, a plot of land, 40 acres, 50 acres, something like that. And so the idea is that the contract sets them up so that they can begin to farm their own stuff and own their own property. Most times, indentured servants didn't complete their contract in one fashion or another, so they didn't get paid off. But there were some that did complete their service and were set up with property and tools and their first year's crop. During his time as an indentured servant, for the length of their contract, they were in effect owned by the person who paid for it. The landowner would buy the indentured contract from the captain, and then the landowner or the person who owned the indentured contract, they were required merely to provide basic shelter, food, and clothing. There was no pay involved. There was no or at least no mandatory training for some sort of job. They were basically just put to work as labor. And many of these indentured servants labored in the production of tobacco. This was a way to increase the amount of people working on your property with something that is, comparatively speaking, very cheap. The cost of the transportation across the Atlantic Ocean was comparatively cheap compared to the cost of African slaves who sold for much higher rates. So this indenturitude kind of developed out of English traditions and kind of developed somewhat organically. It wasn't that this was a system that was imposed. It just kind of met sort of, it kind of formed as a solution to two problems. In England, they had too many laborers and not enough jobs. And in the New World, they had a huge demand for labor, land that could be used profitably, but not enough people to do it. For the landowner, the benefits are fairly clear. You get cheap labor for 4 to 5 years. If the indentured worker dies before the end of their term, you don't have to pay them off at all. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, the landowners figured out a way to get out of having to set up their competition, either by putting them on very unprofitable land or reneging on the deal or some aspect related to that. For the people who signed the contracts to sign themselves into temporary slavery, their opportunities in England were scarce. They had no property. They were competing for arduous and poorly paid jobs when they were available. Oftentimes, they got swept up into some sort of debt issue, so they ended up in debtor's prison. So this was an opportunity to get out of debtor's prison. So there are people with very little opportunity who were taking the risk in the New World. And some of those folks went on to become very successful. Many of the later very wealthy planters in the state of Virginia had their origins as indentured servants. So it's a sign of the desperation of these folks that they're willing to sell themselves into slavery because that sounds like a better job than anything else. So these two major colonial sectors, the Virginia Chesapeake area and the New England area, Virginia had a slight head start in the formation of the colony. New England settled slightly later, began to expand, but these two colonies evolved quite differently. These two settlement areas that aren't quite colonies yet. New England, family units, planters, transforming the land into small land holdings that are then populated by their children, transforming the landscape into ways that suit their needs and away from the needs of what Native peoples had utilized the land for before. In Virginia, this economy was centered around export crop, a monocrop generally, growing tobacco. Tobacco was for a period a lucrative crop. Even when the price declined, it was still an opportunity to make money growing tobacco and for market economy. So it's a global market. They're shipping it back to the old world, and that's what they do. That's their primary business. Much of the labor is compelled labor, and it has an overwhelming young male characteristic to the community as opposed to the family migration into New England. Both these early colonies of the New England, Virginia colonies transformed the landscape and led to increased tensions with the native peoples for fundamentally the same reason. These settlers needed new lands in order to be successful, and the lands were in the hands of the native peoples who didn't want to give them up. And so these are the sources of many of the tensions between the two, and it's an extension of this sort of settler planter lifestyle that is installed. All right, next week we'll have in-person lecture again, so watch for that next Wednesday. And